because the earlier thing of the September the 11th bombings and the London bombings, they're not really associated with any freedom movement for a country or for secession or etc. But when it comes to the Palestinians, it's their homeland, and they've been kicked out of their homeland, and they've been treated as
at the heart of
second
any
and
of
third
these
class
movements,
citizens.
you take Al-Qaeda, at the core of their movement is, if we can find a resolution to this Palestinian-Israel dilemma, then these terrorist acts would kind of disappear. We keep pushing that argument aside. We don't even look at that and think, well, it's a non-issue. And until that issue is addressed, terrorist activities will continue to happen. It's desperate measures by a desperate people.
Yeah, I mean, Al-Qaeda claims to be a Muslim group, and it claims to kind of represent Muslims. But if they endorse openly killing innocent civilians, then of course that's totally against the principles of Islam, and any person would tell you that that's quite clear. The means are never justified by the ends, if that's what they're endorsing. The second thing is that sorry, I kind of forgot your question. I got lost. If
My question is that when a people has been neglected and their voices have not been heard, and they've had sanctions put on them and the people there, and people have died, and you don't have access to medicine, you don't have access to doctors and nurses and food. How else are you supposed to react? What else can you do besides retaliate and act out?
That's right. I mean, as far as the Palestine issue is concerned, the Palestine issue is there for the Palestinians as well as for the general Muslim populace. And the reason for that is because Palestine is a holy land for Muslims, as well as for Christians and for Jews. And that land is believed to be sacred
for Catholics, Jews, and Muslims.
That's right. That's right. And in order to kind of reconcile between the Israelis and the Palestinians with that land, it would solve a lot of problems, no doubt.
But this is one of those issues that I feel like it will not have a peaceful resolution. We won't wake up one day and we won't have Palestinians and Israelis sitting side by side and saying, we're just going to agree to disagree and we're just going to coexist harmoniously. I think that's being too ambitious. But I need to also ask a question. The bombing at the Taj Hotel in Bombay, was that an act of freedom and autonomy, or was that a terrorist act? Either one of you, whoever wants to answer that.
Are we talking about the November attacks on Mumbai? Yeah.
That's right.
As far as I can tell, that was not associated with any particular national liberation movement. That there are stories, there are reports about India and Pakistan using agents to destabilize each other.
Simple terrorist, simple act of terrorism.
It could be state terrorism, it could be terrorism, it could be criminality, but I think that's a case in point where we should all learn to take a step back and actually consider the reality of what's going on. There's a classic example of violence unleashed on innocent civilians, which in my view serves no purpose whatsoever, is morally wrong. And yet you have this term terrorism used that is then spread to cover all sorts of movements across the world, even when they are legitimate movements that do not believe in the classic terrorist activity. So what we have to do is step back from the propaganda. We have to ask people on the street, we have to ask decision makers, policy makers, to be a bit more serious about this.
But do you think decision makers and policy makers are actually listening to people on the street? Do you think that decision makers actually care what a man walking down the street actually thinks? Isn't it just like we've been talking just about political and economic gain?
I think you're right. It's a struggle. It's a challenge to make policy makers believe in concepts like truth and justice when they're involved primarily in short-term economic gain, expediency. Mm-hmm. But these things can happen, and this is why in the long term we shouldn't lose hope. We've seen the USSR disintegrate. We've seen national liberation movements succeed elsewhere. We've seen Yugoslavia, an artificial multinational state, disintegrate. We've seen East Timor. East Timor is very interesting because the UN itself sponsored a plebiscite for the people of East Timor on the question of independence. Mm-hmm. And they voted for independence and they got independence. So there are precedents. Kosovo's been mentioned earlier.
Right.
So there
I
are
mean,
precedents,
these
and
stories,
we can
these are
pin
really
some
all
hope.
encouraging and gives us some hope that
That's
yes,
right.
we can have a peaceful resolution to freedom fighting and to movements. I'm going to come back to violence again because the reason being terrorism and freedom fighting, in a sense, are linked into violence, and violence is intertwined in both of these words and definitions of both of these words. Now, I know that, Mr. Starr, you're of the opinion, and I think both of you share it, that violence is not necessarily the answer, and killing innocent people isn't justified. If you take innocent civilians out of it, is it justified to kill politicians who are opposing your movement? Is that okay?
No, certainly not. I mean, the politicians are there for a reason, and that reason is in order to kind of make dialogue between them, and in order to engage in peaceful protests, peaceful demonstrations, peaceful lobbying, etc., and try to change the view of the politicians. Now, if the politicians themselves, if as a group, if they have a certain self-interest, certain economic interest, they
Well, we had the
will
American
obviously
Army gun down Saddam Hussein. Execute him and
Yep.
kick him out of his little tunnel. Mrs. Farr, what do you think? Do you think it's okay to target a politician?
Again, let's not overgeneralize the situation. It's very dangerous. It's simple, it's easy, but overgeneralization causes problems.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Remember, there were attempts on Adolf Hitler's life. Several attempts.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now, can anybody seriously suggest that it was wrong to take out Adolf Hitler?
So it is sometimes justified.
This was a man
do this.
who was killing Jews in their millions.
Mm-hmm.
And unashamedly, and would have carried on, and was also causing war and mayhem across the whole of Europe and elsewhere. This is a man who, if there was an international court that had power and authority at that time, should have been brought before the law and made accountable in a court of law. Mm-hmm. Frankly, it's the best way of dealing with these people, because you then have the international community, the moral majority, declaring criminals like Hitler
Right, okay.
criminals,
Mm-hmm.
and they go down in history as criminals. So frankly, that's the best way of achieving this. But let's avoid overgeneralization again. Can I just add one other element to this, which is that the real culprit here, I mean, terrorism, we've talked about, and we've tried to dissect what is actual terrorism and separate out from that legitimate resistance from legitimate national liberation movements. But the biggest culprit, and it's the fault of the international media, frankly, for not exposing the biggest culprit, mm-hmm. And that's state terrorism. In most of the conflicts that we've talked about today, the vast majority of violence has been carried out by the state. Now, the state itself is carrying out atrocities. This is something that the international community needs to focus on. The media needs to focus on. And actually, let's debunk some of the myths around, Kashmiris as terrorists, Kurds as terrorists, Tamils as terrorists. And let's talk about who's actually carrying out real terrorism on a mass scale,
Right.
in a systematic way. And quite often you'll find it are states that are responsible for this.
I think we need to take responsibility of what we are digesting. So not taking everything at face value, doing our
Absolutely.
own research, making our own mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the answer is violence ever justified hasn't really been conclusive. And defining what is a terrorist and what is a freedom fighter is not as easy as we think it might be. You're watching Broken Silence. I'm Sanyya Gardez. I'll be back next week, same time, same place.